And we'll just give everybody a few minutes here to get situated. This has been an event that I have been looking forward to, so I'm so glad that all of you are here to join us this evening. I'm not going to say too terribly much. I'll let everybody get in and get situated. And we're going to, again, remind you that we're just going to ask you to keep your cameras off and your mics muted. But at the very end, there will be an opportunity where if you are comfortable enough, everyone, feel free to turn your cameras on so that you can say hi and wave to Liza and to Kate. But for the presentation, we are going to ask you to keep your cameras off and your mics muted. There will also be a Q&A at the end. So as you're listening to Liza and Kate talk about this book, feel free to drop any questions that you might have in the chat, and we will go through those towards the end. But I think that really, without further ado, we are just going to jump right in. Oh, we've got a couple more people in the waiting room, so let me get them in here. There we are. Again, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Kathleen. I am with Anderson's Bookshop. I'm actually the kids manager in Downers Grove. So I don't usually get to read a whole lot of adult books. My primary focus for the company is kids books. So I'm very guarded. I guard the time that I have for adult books with all of my heart. And so I was so excited when this advanced copy of The Woman That Could Not Keep Silent crossed my desk, because I had loved Radium Girls so much. So I knew that this was going to be a no-brainer for me. But Kate, dare I say that I loved this book more than Radium Girls? And I did not think that that was possible. But somebody said to me the other day, well, as I was telling them about this book, well, we know that Kathleen really loves a book when she gets overly dramatic about it. And I really think that that's probably the best way for me to describe my reaction to this book, because you just made me so passionate about Elizabeth's story and wanting to know more. You put up with my rage tweeting as I was reading this book, because I just could not believe what poor Elizabeth was going through. And this is a woman that I knew absolutely nothing about. And now I want everybody in the state of Illinois to read her story. I want a statue for her. I want a stamp for her. So thank you, Kate, for this book that is just going to open up another piece of history, and a piece of history that has been quiet and has been silent for all of us. So I could wax on, but y'all, we have got a great event tonight, because it's not just Kate Moore. That would be enough, but it's not just Kate Moore. We have the wonderful Liza Mundy here of Code Girls, who is going to be our hostess with the mostest. So y'all, it's a twofer, and it's going to be a great evening. So I'm going to turn off my mic and my camera, and I'm going to let you two lovely ladies take it away. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank for having us. I had the great pleasure of meeting Kate in person, and one of the, I think, the great pleasures of publishing a book is getting to meet other authors who you admire, and there's nobody I admire more than Kate. And we were on a panel, I think it was 3 years ago, at a book festival. The panel was called War Girls, and Kate was talking about her wonderful book Radium Girls, which takes place during World War I, and I was talking about my book about women code breakers, which takes place during World War II. And of course, Kate's latest book is also set during wartime, and a period where our nation was tested, and themes of improving our nation's laws, emancipation, oppression, are all in the background and the foreground of this new book. And so it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm sorry we can't be here in person, but it's wonderful to have this format and know that this event will live on online, and that people really all over the world will be able to benefit from Kate's personal insights, and from the ability to hear Kate read a bit of her book, because I'm hoping that we can start out. Kate actually reads the audiobook, so you could have access to the whole story. But just for tonight, Kate, if you would treat us, setting the stage for the conversation with a reading of your wonderful words.
I'd be delighted to. And thank you so much, Liza, for being here. I'm a huge admirer of your work and just yourself as a person. So I'm really honoured that you're joining me today to talk about, here it is, my baby, The Woman They Could Not Silence. So yes, I'm going to kick off with a short reading from the book. It's going to be an edited extract from chapter 1, which always seems a good place to start. So the date is June 18th, 1860. The place is Manteno, Illinois. It was the last day, but she didn't know it. In truth, we never do, not until it is too late. She woke in a handsome maple bed, body covered by a snow-white counterpane. As her senses resurfaced after a restless night's sleep, Elizabeth Packard's brown eyes blearily mapped the landmarks of her room: embroidered ottoman, mahogany bureau, and smart green shutters that, for some reason, were failing to let in any light. Ordinarily, her husband of 21 years, Theophilus, a preacher, would have been snoring next to her, his gravity-defying curly red hair an impromptu pillow beneath his head. But a few long weeks before, he'd abandoned their marital bed. He thought it best, or so he'd said, to sleep alone these days. Instead, her senses were filled by the precious proximity of her slumbering 6-year-old son. Her children were truly the sun, moon, and stars to Elizabeth. To see their happy faces and laughing eyes offered such blessed light. It was particularly welcome in a world that was becoming, by the day, increasingly black. Such melancholy thoughts were uncharacteristic for Elizabeth. In normal times, the 43-year-old was always rejoicing. But the splits that were even now threatening her country, with some forecasting an all-out civil war, were mirrored in her small domestic sphere within her neat 2-story home. Over the past 4 months, she and her husband had retreated behind those enemy lines, prompting much anxious foreboding from Elizabeth. The Packards had married in 1839, when Elizabeth was a green 22 and Theophilus a dusty 37. At first, all had seemed well. Elizabeth had been raised to be a silent listener, and her preacher husband contentedly became the sole mouthpiece in their marriage. To make him happy was the height of my ambition, Elizabeth wrote. That's all I wanted, to make my husband shine inside and out. The problem in their marriage had been he didn't make her shine in return. Their characters were as opposite as it was possible to get. Where Elizabeth was vibrant, sociable, and curious, Theophilus was gloomy, timorous, and, in his own words, dull. Elizabeth described their marriage as cheerless. Nevertheless, she said nothing to him directly. That is, until everything changed. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, unleashing a national conversation about the rights of women. It was one in which Elizabeth and, less willingly, Theophilus took part. Countless times, the couple had warm discussions on the subject. It was Elizabeth, naturally blessed with a most rare command of language, who triumphed in these fights. Yet her victories came at a cost. She felt the demonstration of her intellect prompted jealousy, lest I outshine him. Theophilus was stung to the quick, and his grievances slowly grew. He was the kind of man who counted them like pennies, recording slights in his diary with the miserly accuracy of a rich man unwilling to share his wealth. He grumbled crossly, "My wife was unfavorably affected by the tone of society and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along." Perhaps the notion that caused him most consternation? In Elizabeth's words, I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his. Elizabeth's newfound autonomy was anathema to Theophilus. Wives, obey your husbands became a scriptural passage oft quoted in their home. But Elizabeth was no longer silently listening. Defiantly, she kept on articulating her own thoughts, asserting her own self, inspired by the women's rights movement that it was her right to do so. Theophilus's response was telling. He did not allow his wife agency. He did not encourage her independence. Instead, he wrote that he had sad reason to fear his wife's mind was getting out of order. She was becoming insane on the subject of women's rights. On the morning of June 18th, 1860, Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in bed, her disquiet slowly intensifying. Over the past 4 months, Theophilus had made it plain he wanted her gone. He could not cope with his newly outspoken wife, with her independent mind and her independent spirit, not least because Elizabeth did not keep her new character confined to their home. She asserted herself in public too. In the face of her impassioned eloquence, Theophilus felt powerless and furiously impotent. He conceived a plan. He kept it simple, just 7 words intended to silence her once and for all. When the Packards next argued, he warned Elizabeth if she did not conform, I shall put you into the asylum. There you go.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's mesmerizing. It's just magical to listen to you read it. So there are so many ways in which this historical account that took place more than 150 years ago is sort of and uncannily relevant to the current day. One of the ones that maybe you didn't intend is the theme of isolation and being shut in, which we've all experienced over the past year, and also the need and urge to communicate from a place of being isolated. And then obviously the treatment of a woman at the hands of a man who is intimately involved with her, who is threatened by her intellectual superiority in this case, and is increasingly abusive toward her and empowered by society to do that, and her efforts to rally the community to her cause and to speak out. So I wonder if you could talk about what, and there's so many other ways in which the book is relevant, and you never hit us over the head with them when you're telling this tale. I mean, you're such a storyteller, and you always let this be foremost and most important. But I wondered if you could talk about what aspects of this story did you know starting out would be relevant to the present day when you started your research, and what additional sort of points of relevance emerged during the course of your research that maybe even surprised you. And I'm hoping you could use this question as an opportunity to talk about the genesis of the book and how you decided to tell this story.
Yeah, I think it's the perfect lead into the genesis of the story, actually, because this was a really sort of topsy-turvy discovery of Elizabeth's story, because I went looking for her story. I didn't know her name, which I'm sure most people have never heard her name either. So I didn't know that she existed in order to want to write about her. I didn't find her first. My inspiration for the book actually came about because of the Me Too movement in the fall of 2017. And I was really struck and empowered by that movement, as I know women across the globe were. But what really struck me about it was that it had taken so long for this movement to take fire, because women always speak up and speak out, you know. But the difference this time with the Me Too movement is that finally we were being listened to and believed. And it got me thinking, well, why hasn't that happened before? And as I was thinking about these ideas and wondering what I'd write about next, it all coalesced around this single concept and realization that for centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. Our mental health has been wielded as a weapon against us, to silence us, to discredit us, to control us. And that is still happening today. And, you know, Me Too was the genesis of the movement. But even as I started researching the book and sort of coming up with the idea that I wanted to write about the ways in which women are silenced through this allegation of insanity, it was happening all around me. You might remember Nancy Pelosi standing up to Donald Trump, that very famous shot of her in her electric blue suit, you know, opposite this bank of old white men. Trump tweeted after that meeting about Pelosi, "There's something wrong with her upstairs. She is a very sick person." Vice President Kamala Harris was called a mad woman once it was announced that she was going to be the vice president pick for Biden. So this is all around us, you know, right up until, you know, the present day. And so it seems super relevant to me. But as you say, what I am above all else is a storyteller. So I didn't want to write a polemic. I didn't want to rant about things, although I could easily, get on my soapbox and do that. What I wanted to do was to try to find one woman in history who this had happened to, through whose story I could explore these issues. And so I went looking for Elizabeth Packard. I fell down this rabbit warren of internet searches about women and madness. And what I think is really interesting, and I was talking about this with a friend the other day, is I didn't know what period of history I was going to find this woman. And so I looked at cases with, you know, lobotomies from the 1950s. I looked at, you know, women who suffered electric shock therapies. What was striking is I didn't know where she would come from, but I knew that she would exist. And as it happened, I found a woman from the 1860s, from the American Civil War period. And the moment I found Elizabeth's name, which I did in a random University of Wisconsin essay that I just happened upon online as I was internet searching, hoping to find the figure I would write about next, I found there was a single reference to her name in this essay. And I started looking into her and very quickly realized she was going to be the one, because her story is extraordinary. It's so compelling. It's so packed full of drama. I loved the fact that there was this almost gothic horror of, you know, a sane woman sent to an insane asylum, you know, the horror of what was going on in those asylums. I love the fact that it's actually an inspiring story too, because Elizabeth is such a strong woman. And I loved that she herself was also a writer, and I've used her words in the book as well. So that was sort of how I came to the story. And I've spoken in that about the resonance that for me, this story has, in that I still, you know, you just have to turn on the news, go on Twitter, and you will find people accusing strong women of being mad, because it's still happening today. And I hope as readers go on this journey with Elizabeth, you will get swept up in her story, but I hope can also see the parallels that are happening even still today.
So in Radium Girls, you ably manage a very large cast of characters. And I so your ability to do that narratively, to tell that story of a whole group of women who are also so inspirational and fight for their rights and change society and change laws for the better. And in this book, you have a deep, deep dive into a single person's story, just a few years in the course of a woman's life and the history of our country. And I'm wondering, and she lived 150 years ago more, you didn't have a chance to interview her. You had to rely entirely on research and historical records to life and to tell the full story, the full dramatic story. And I'm wondering if that was daunting at all. Because you are a scrupulous nonfiction writer. Every word of it is true and documented. I think about the intimacy of that scene that you read, where, we're not just in her mind, we're in her bed and her bedroom, and we're seeing the room through her eyes. And you conjure that whole scene based on the actual historical record. It's all fact-based. And so I wondered if you could talk about your research methods, what resources you were able to call upon to write this story, and and again, whether it was daunting to know that this was a tale that was going to hang on one woman's story.
Well, I think actually the fact it was one woman's story was something that appealed to me as a writer, because readers have been incredibly kind about Radium Girls in saying how much they loved it, which is just, as you know, as a writer yourself, just amazing when someone loves this, one of your books. But I would say the criticism or the challenge that most readers had with Radium Girls was keeping track of all the different characters, so much so that there is a list at the start of Radium Girls with all the characters' names, so that if you get confused as you're reading the narrative, you can go back and check who was who, who was whose sister, and so on and so forth. So actually the fact that it was one woman wasn't daunting. That was actually, that was another sort of tick in the box of choosing to write about Elizabeth, because I hoped that readers who might have found the cast of characters challenging in Radium Girls would be able to go on this journey with this one woman. It would be less confusing. So that was actually something that I was
of getting enough material. Will I have enough material?
Yeah. Well, and again, part of the reason for choosing Elizabeth is that once I started looking into her, part of her extraordinary story and part of the narrative of the book is the way that she becomes the woman they could not silence, and how she finds this unsilenceable voice that she has. So the gift with writing about Elizabeth is that she did become a writer, first and foremost in the asylum. So, she was not actually permitted to write. That was forbidden, because Elizabeth, I've described in that opening chapter how eloquent she was, the fact that her husband, couldn't win arguments with her. Well, she took that eloquence into the asylum. And when she saw abuse around her, she saw women, being abused by the attendants, the callous cruelty, this awful situation of sane women being locked up simply because they're assertive and they're causing trouble to their families. She spoke out against that and caused trouble in the asylum too. So she was forbidden from writing, forbidden from having a voice, but she used to steal scraps of fabric and rip out the margins in newspapers so that she could scribble in the margin next to the type. This was how she maintained a secret journal, a journal that still survives and that I was able to draw on in the book. And one of the things I find extraordinary about Elizabeth is she became a published writer. No publisher would touch her because of the stigma of, mental insanity, because she'd gone to an asylum, even though she was a sane woman, and ultimately manages to prove that. Simply because she'd been locked up for 3 years, no publisher would touch it. But Elizabeth, because she's extraordinary, thinks, okay, well, how am I going to get my words out there? Because I'm determined that I will. And, this is a woman who is absolutely penniless. She has no career. She has no home. She has, all she has is the sort of, her brain and the clothes that she stands up in. And she still determined she's going to get her voice out there. And, very modern approach, she decides essentially to crowdfund her books. She literally hand sells them. She speaks to everyone that she can find and gets them to give her 50 cents so that she can put, she essentially persuades thousands of people to give her 50 cents, and then she can print her books. And those books is the reason it was still a daunting research project, but I knew I would succeed in the intimate narrative portrait I wanted to create. Because in Elizabeth's books, they are memoirs, they are first-person accounts of what has happened to her. And so in the book, I'm literally able to share with you what she was thinking and feeling at any one time, because they are published in her books. And it's those books, along with all the other research that I did, that I was able to, bring to life her story and to give that intimacy to it. The gift is Elizabeth's own voice that she left behind for me to find.
Yeah, she was calling out. You talk in the book about, she discovered as she was going door to door at some, her crowdsourcing was literally going door to door, and getting people to sort of subscribe to what she had either published or was going to write, and so you say in the book that she learned about the power of her personal story, and as she was going around to talk to editors, that they responded to her in person and to her story. And it's just striking how, in a way, her story was calling out to you, across the centuries in a way that's, imagine she would have thought if she had known that that was going to happen, or maybe she did. I mean, she was just, she grows so much during the course of the story.
Yeah.
We talk about words like resilience and grit, and sometimes we talk, there's something called post-traumatic growth, of people to expand as a result of a traumatic experience, which of course you wouldn't wish on anybody. But her growth and the way that she finds herself and realizes her capacities is just, it's just extraordinary.
It really is. And I think her spirit really shines out. And I hope something that readers will take away from them in reading the book is that inspirational journey that she goes on. I was, looking back at the earlier chapters just the other week, and a quote of hers really stood out to me. And it was from the summer of 1860, as she's, just hesitantly, starting to articulate her own thoughts. And she goes and attends a Bible class that's run by her husband's church. And she writes of sitting in this room, everyone's sharing their theological opinions and so on. And she says, I felt so small somehow, as though nothing I said was hardly worth saying or hearing. And it really struck a chord with me, because I know I felt like that in, work meetings in the past, that you're kind of sitting there feeling really intimidated, wondering if you can speak up about things. And to think of her being that woman, and yet the woman she is by the end of the book, she moves from this small domestic sphere, which is all that she's been given, the room to conquer at the start of the book, to a point where, the whole world is her oyster, and she is, strong enough and big enough and powerful enough to fill it and to, lead her own way in the world. I just think that's such an inspirational journey that I think anyone, any woman, any man, it's about finding your voice. That's ultimately what I think this book is about, and then using it for the greater good. And I think that's just such a narrative that I hope will resonate with a lot of people even today.
And the bravery that she shows and the kindness that she shows, ability to win, people to her cause, people who work at the asylum, staff members who are appalled at what they see going on, fellow inmates who see in her leadership abilities, and then when she's out in public, getting people to subscribe to her story, and ultimately, editors to be willing, lawyers to take on her cause. Her ability through these positive actions to win people, to win the community. The role of friends and neighbors who know what's going on, who are powerless in some points against these laws that are protecting her husband. But her personal charisma and her kindness toward other suffering people is really extraordinary. So the book is so inspirational. But let's also talk about some of the sort of gothic horror scenes that she encounters in the asylum. I mean, there are scenes, Kate, where I realized that the treatment of the inmates involving, putting them in these bathtubs, I realized these women are being waterboarded. And the torture really that's taking place, the shocking truths about the scientific establishment and the treatment of the mentally ill at that time is it
literally takes your breath away. And I think, there are these horrific scenes of abuse that I describe because Elizabeth witnessed them and she describes them, and they're part of what drives her really to protect the mentally ill. You can actually trace, the movement that we see today, advocating for the mentally ill, this, the way that mental health has become this topic that we do finally talk about, and we have sensitivity to people who are struggling with their mental health. You can actually trace that back all the way back to Elizabeth Packard, who was sort of the matriarch of this, of realizing that people, with mental illness are humans. They're not, people literally used to pay a shilling to go and see the beasts rave at Bedlam in England. People used to think of the mentally ill as literally beasts, other creatures. They didn't have the mental capacity that would define them as human. This is like what the theory ran. But Elizabeth had a totally different approach. She was like, no, they're people. They deserve our love, our kindness. So that was something that really, she was new at doing and really changed the world. It was just one of the many ways that she changed the world. I think what shocked me more actually was the research that I did around the treatments that were offered to these women, because in some ways the abuse of vulnerable people is something that still happens today. In some ways, you don't want to expect it, but power corrupts. And when you have attendants who have absolute power over the women in their charge, they're going to abuse it, and they do. But what shocked me more, I think, was reading about, for example, the fact that assertive women were medicalized and diagnosed as being mad and sent away. I was shocked that because doctors of the time thought that simply being a woman, having a female body, made you liable to go mad because of your menstrual cycle, the treatments focused on women's sexual organs too. So that there were, they would put leeches on women's genitals to try and cure their emotional disorder. Horrific surgeries that I read about. I was really, really shocked that they essentially carried out female genital mutilation. And you read the case notes of these doctors who performed clitoridectomies, and the women that they're operating on, are not mad at all. Obviously, even if they were struggling with their mental health, this is not the way to solve it. But these are women who, do no more than engage in serious reading, for example. There was a 30-year-old who was operated on who had simply expressed, dislike for the society of her husband. And yet, because that woman was not being the placid woman who wanted to absorb the male gaze, she actually had an opinion on whether she liked her husband or not. She was seen as mad and therefore subjected to this horrifying surgical treatment. So I think those were the things that actually horrified me even more, to see what the doctors of the time were saying and doing. The way female behavior was medicalized. These were the things that really troubled me and haunted me as I was continuing my research.
And the link between education and mental illness. I mean, you have a list that would be sort of entertaining if it weren't actually true, of the conditions that could lead a woman to be committed. And one of them was, excessive reading of novels, or being overly educated. We sort of can laugh at it now, or just forget that it happened. But the idea that if a woman became too educated, that she also needed to be. And that was for two reasons that they thought educated women were mad. Number one was because she was pushing those boundaries. Women were supposed to be content just to be wives and mothers. If you aspired to anything else, then that was unnatural. And if it was unnatural, then it was therefore sick. You were defined as, mentally unwell. But the other thing was just using your brain at all. They thought that made you susceptible to nervous derangements. And I think, a quote that really stayed with me was a doctor who went to visit an all-girls high school. This was in 1858, so 2 years before, the book opens in 1860. And the doctor said to the teachers at this all-girls high school, "You're training your girls for the lunatic asylum," because they thought that women who use their brains would ultimately have a mental breakdown, that their brains would not be able to cope with this study, basically. So just an observation, I think when a lot of us think about the feminist movement of the late 19th century, people who know about it would focus on the suffrage movement, the movement to give women the right to vote and or to have more of a role in public life. And what you remind us is that there was So incredibly important push to give women more power in their marriage. I mean, that women lost their identity when they married. They were declared civilly dead. And that the feminists of that period were advocating for women's right to divorce. If they did divorce, for them to gain custody, to be able to have of their children, the right to have autonomy and equal rights in their home and in their marriage and in their relationships with men and with their children was such an important part of that movement as well. And I think we sometimes forget about that. And so I'm just, you again, like, so never heard of this woman, and yet the laws that she got changed, the married women property laws, and are just, I think we take it for granted at this point.
We do. And you say it's such an important part of history and an important part of the book, because you're right, when women got married, they basically lost their civic identity, because the law said the husband and the wife are one, but that one is the husband, and the wife then just became a shadow.
She doesn't.
She literally doesn't exist. So therefore she has no recourse to, freedom. So, and actually she loses control over her very liberty. So that this was another thing I was really shocked to discover. You look up the laws surrounding committing people to asylums in the mid-19th century. By law, a husband could send his wife to an asylum by request if he wanted to. And there would be no need for there to be any evidence. It's specifically written in the law that in the case of married women, they can be committed without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. So a husband can literally just send his wife away if that's what he chooses to do. And of course, many husbands did, whether that was because their wives were assertive, as Elizabeth was, whether it was because they wanted to have an affair, because, there were cases of women asking for divorces and then their husbands sending them away to asylums instead because they didn't want, to go through with that. So it was really quite shocking that the legal injustice was set up in that way. And Elizabeth is horrified to discover it. She actually can't believe that that's the situation she finds herself in. And Elizabeth, being Elizabeth, as she becomes stronger, which, as you say, happens because of this crucible of suffering that she goes through. One of my favorite quotes in the book is, "The worst that my enemies can do, they have done, and I fear them no more. I am now free to be true and honest." And that fearlessness means that Elizabeth will take on the world, and she will change those laws that have oppressed her, but are also oppressing millions of other women.
And as a former newspaper reporter, I just want to shout out to newspapers. You alluded at the beginning to the Me Too movement and why it was that women got traction, for suffering that they had endured, for forever, and that there was something about that moment that gave the movement traction. And obviously a big part of it was publication. The New York Times's publication, having women reporters, women editors working that story and persuading women to come forward to talk about it. Newspapers and this fact of publication was a big part, I think, of what launched the Me Too movement and social media's ability to amplify it. And so again, when Elizabeth is so bravely doing, the shoe leather work of visiting editors' offices and going door to door in order to tell her story and tell it in the paper, and publishing, what amounts to an expose of what was going on in the asylum. In many ways, she's, Nellie Bly did that when she went undercover and published what it was like in lunatic asylum, and of course she did that deliberately, and it's as though Elizabeth Packard was obliged to do it, not willingly, but eventually discovered the power of publication. It's just a striking parallel to me.
It is. Nellie Bly was actually about 25 years later, I think, if I've got my history right. And isn't that interesting that 25 years later, despite everything that Elizabeth's doing, the situation is the same. As you say, Nellie Bly deliberately got herself locked up there. Right. I think Nellie Bly's story, highlights something that Elizabeth experienced as well, which is once the allegation of insanity has been made against you, everyone assesses your actions in a different way. So Nellie Bly, once she was in the asylum, she couldn't get out because even though she was sane, everything she did was perceived as mad. And that was the same problem that Elizabeth had. Also because of the way women, female insanity was defined at that time. So there's a line in the book where I say, the harder Elizabeth fought for her freedom, the more likely it was that her husband would win and would successfully commit her. Because what could she do? If she got angry and shouted at him, well, then she's an angry woman. Well, that's unnatural, isn't it? That's, mentally disturbed and irrational, because women are supposed to be placid and timid, and they're not supposed to shout, and they're not supposed to get angry and impassioned. The textbook definitions of female insanity at that time included women who had ungovernable personalities, or who had strong resolution, plenty of what is termed nerve. Now, I think those are the women I'd like to be friends with, but in the 19th century, they were seen as women who were mad. So as I say, anything that Elizabeth tried to do, if she shouted, if she got angry, if she got het up, all of that was actually feeding into the narrative that she was a mad woman.
She was also incredibly disciplined. I mean, she was like, in many ways, I think like a prisoner of war in some ways. I mean, she's doing calisthenics, like she's keeping herself fit. And she's teaching herself how to do it. She developed her own exercises. And it's just, the ways in which she kept herself sane and strong are extraordinary. And the other extraordinary thing, and the wonderful and inspirational part of your book, which is wonderful and inspirational, is her love for her children and, her maternal qualities. The idea that an educated woman somehow loses touch with her femininity or her womanhood or her motherliness, could not be farther from the truth. I think, a lot of the times that's what's keeping her going as well, is the desire to be reunited with her children.
Absolutely. And I think when you think about the reality of what she had to experience, Elizabeth was a mother of 6. So at the time when the book opens, her eldest son is 18 years old. Her youngest son is 18 months old. Now, just any mothers among you, imagine leaving, or even if you're not a mother, imagine leaving an 18-month-old baby, being torn from him, being sent away for 3 years, without seeing any of his childhood. And even after that 3 years, she has no right to see her children. Her husband takes them away, forbids her, from seeing them. So it's really, awful. And as you say, something that really drives Elizabeth, and it's one of the sort of key narrative threads throughout the book as well, her desire to be with her children, her sense of loss and devastation that she's not there to mother them. In particular, she has one daughter of the 6 children, and she's so conscious that with her having been sent away to the asylum, her daughter, who is 10 at the time, she is doing everything that Elizabeth did because she's now the only woman in the house. So her husband, Theophilus, expects his 10-year-old daughter to do the cooking, the cleaning, the looking after the baby, the gardening, the laundry, the sewing, everything is now dumped on Libby's shoulders. That is something, again, that is driving Elizabeth as she's trying to get out, trying to get messages back to her children, because, she's a mother above all else, and she wants them to know, she pines for them desperately and wants to be there for them, to mother them and help them find their way in the world.
And this of other women who are in the asylum with her. And, some of your moving scenes are about just the women's grieving and keening and missing their children. And the superintendent finds it annoying to have to listen to them. I know we want to open it up for questions, but your book just reminds us, through the sufferings of her daughter, through Elizabeth's sufferings and the other women, she got these laws changed. I mean, the freedom that we take for granted, I think often, is there were real people who won these freedoms and these rights. for us. And it's so moving and readers should know that the story, although parts of it are so difficult and sad, that the story is absolutely inspirational. I mean, she fights every step of the way, and she goes mano a womano with men who want to keep her down, and she prevails over and over and over. And so the reader ends up feeling very inspired by her story, with a very thorough understanding of what she's gone through.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm glad that was what you took from it as well. I find her incredibly inspiring. When you think of everything that she went through and everything that she achieved, she's truly astonishing. And I think, again, one of my favorite quotes from her is she's talking about, in the asylum, the women are supposed to go through this subduing treatment and be sort of broken in so that they can return to their husbands as obedient wives. But Elizabeth writes, in my case, this woman crushing machinery works the wrong way. The true woman shines brighter and brighter under the process instead of being strangled. And that's what happened to her. So I'm so pleased that you took that inspiration from her story.
And before we jump into the questions, one of the things that I also struck me is the amount of grace that Elizabeth had. And I've mentioned this more than once, but, if that had been me, I get discharged, I would have been bent on destruction and revenge and getting back. And Elizabeth just moves forward and continues that fight that she had that kept her sane while she was in the insane asylum, and just continues to move forward through that. And I don't know that I would have been able to do the same thing. And that was one of the things that struck me so much about Elizabeth's story, was that grace that she kept intact the whole time.
Absolutely.
We do have a great question from Terry that I did want to bring up. And she was wondering, Kate, how you cope with immersing yourself in these horrific stories for any length of time while you are writing.
People do ask that. And I think I feel a sense of responsibility. So you're there to pay witness. A lot of people said with Radium Girls that, they found it so hard to read, especially the horrifying medical things that the women are going through. But I always said, in that case, but the thing is, the women had to go through them. So I can't turn my face away or not include that in the book. Yes, it's graphic in places, but it's graphic because I want people to understand what these women and what these people were going through. And the same applies to the woman they could not silence as well. So I think what gets me through these sort of dark times is just this responsibility to bear witness. I think if anything, I sometimes get angry, but all of that pours into the book and sort of drives me to stay with that darkness and to, in some ways, illuminate it for readers. So I think, that's what drives me. That's how I get through the dark times, is knowing that I'm bringing it into the light.
And we had this comment from Samantha, which leads me to a question that I wanted to ask. And she said, I actually grew up in Manteno, Illinois, not originally from there, but had just heard about Elizabeth last year. The people who have been born and bred in Manteno keep the history of the state mental hospital as something that you didn't talk about. She's a social worker, and she thanks you, Kate, for writing about this topic, as many men would, if they were tired of their wife, would just send them to the asylum. And I remember in the presentation that you did with the booksellers, you talked about the Jacksonville newspaper. I think was it the 100-year anniversary of the asylum, when they called Elizabeth a nut job with a mouth. So here it is 100 years after the fact, and they're still dismissing everything that she worked for and fought for. And they honored, was it the doctor, the head of the asylum?
There's a mental health center in Springfield, the McFarland Center. named after the doctor who kept Elizabeth incarcerated. And I was able to draw on his writings as well as I wrote the book, you know, his letters about Elizabeth, the notes that he made about her case. And you can see in black and white that he was keeping her locked up because she hated her husband, for example. You know, he writes, her hatred of her husband had something diabolical about it. He didn't think it was safe for her to return, you know, to be a wife and mother in that household because of this, what he thought of as irrational hatred of her husband. Now, I'm sure everyone listening to what I've described her husband having done to her, well, of course she hates it. You know, but for the doctor, that hatred was evidence of madness, because she was supposed to express affection to her husband because he was her husband. That's what women were supposed to do. So he's been honoured with a mental health centre in Springfield, but nothing for Elizabeth to date.
Which is just such a travesty. And you had mentioned that when she died, she was as famous as Harriet Beecher Stowe. But
her obituary mentioned, compared her to Harriet Beecher Stowe. They said perhaps there was no one except Harriet Beecher Stowe who did more, you know, to improve humanity while she lived, basically. So they spoke of her in the same breath in her obituaries of Harriet Beecher Stowe.
But then her story just kind of disappears into history. And I know you talked to us a little bit about that, about how her family was almost afraid to talk about her children because of the stigma that was attached to that.
Yes, that's right, because I did reach out to her family to interview them for the book, which was a huge part of my research process for the Radium Girls. But of course, the Radium Girls was set in the First World War, the Roaring 20s. You know, the time period was so much closer that I was able to speak to sisters and husbands and sons and daughters who knew the women and could tell me all about them. Whereas when I reached out to Elizabeth's family, it's great-great-granddaughters I'm speaking to. And as you say, actually, not only did they not know Elizabeth personally, but the stories had not been passed down through the family, because around the turn of the century, the ideas about insanity changed. And they began to think of it as a genetic problem, a hereditary problem. And therefore, if you were mad, you know, they sent you away and, you know, locked you up and threw away the key, essentially. They didn't want you to procreate. There were involuntary sterilizations. And for the family, you know, even knowing Elizabeth was sane, but she had this stigma of what had happened, and there was this pernicious, you know, tenacity to the way that stigma of insanity haunted her. That's partly why she's been forgotten, because psychiatrists in the 20th century dismissed her. You know, they just said she was a mad woman who tried to ruin the career of a brilliant doctor, McFarland. And so the families didn't pass the stories down, because I think the children didn't want to tell their children in case it was hereditary. I think it was best to sort of keep silent about it. So it wasn't only the passage of time that made it difficult for her family to speak to me about her. It was also that the stories hadn't been passed on. There were no anecdotes to share. The one thing I did love about speaking to the families, though, is they did still have her books. They had the original first editions of Elizabeth's books that were signed. And her great-great-granddaughter told me that she kept them on her mantelpiece, and they'd been there, you know, throughout her, you know, the great-great-granddaughter's life. And she said whenever there was a key family moment, so for example, you know, the proms of her children, she would take the prom pictures with the books on the mantelpiece in shot behind the children, so that it would feel like Elizabeth was part of that family moment. So they are super proud of what she achieved now. They're super excited that the book's coming out. And I just loved that Elizabeth was remaining part of the action even after all these years.
Absolutely. And we have a great question from Kara, going back to what you were talking about with the doctor wanting to fix Elizabeth to return her back to her husband. But Kara was wondering if, in doing your research, did you ever find anything in the doctor or the husband's own words or writings that would have led you to believe that there was any sense of guilt that they had been feeling, or remorse for what they were putting Elizabeth through, or questioning whether they were doing the right thing by her or not?
Yes, I did. I did have a chance to dig into what the doctor and what the husband thought. The husband left behind a diary and a memoir. So again, I was able to draw on his first person account, what he was thinking and feeling. And McFarland wrote letters about Elizabeth. And so I was able to draw on them. You know, he mentions her in his biennial reports that he published for the asylum. So there was a lot of material to draw on. And no, they never expressed any remorse, any guilt. They were completely convinced that they were doing the right thing. If anything, the way Elizabeth conducted herself, you know, the fact she became this incredible, you know, public woman, a political campaigner, an author, someone who lectured, who drew public attention to these, you know, awful things that were happening. For them, for the husband and doctor, that was just more evidence of her madness. You know, even the doctor sort of writes, you know, even if what she said was true, that she'd been sent away, you know, unfairly, he said, just look at the way she's conducted herself. You know, would any woman wronged, you know, conduct herself in the way that she has, in, you know, striving so publicly to overturn what has happened? You know, is her course of action a natural one? So even the fact that she then became a campaigner, for them, was not evidence of her sanity, it was evidence of her insanity.
And I think the ultimate irony, right, is, and you address this, you know, fairly early on, is that Elizabeth was just so content to be a wife and a mother, right? Theo was not necessarily the man that she would have picked herself. You know, it was an arranged marriage, you know, her father picked her, but she was content. She loved being a mother more than anything. And if Theo had just her be, none of this would have happened. And she might have even been more closer to the wife to be modeled by, if he had just let her read and learn and have these conversations over the dinner table, instead of being threatened by her. Right? That's the ultimate irony.
Yeah, completely. Because you know, for 21 years, Elizabeth didn't cause, you know, any trouble. It was only as she became more assertive that Theophilus, you know, had an issue with it. And you're right, you know, she loved being a mother, and she said, you know, she was a woman who wouldn't half do anything. So she was a brilliant householder. And what I found quite interesting in her writings is she labors the point several times about what a great wife and mother she was. And she's not boasting, she's using it to say, you know, how can this have happened to me? Because, you know, all I did was think my own thoughts and say, this is what I believe. You know, she cannot believe that just doing that has got her locked up in the asylum, because she did everything else right, as it were. You know, she really sort of says, you know, it's essentially, she's saying, I kept up my end of the bargain. You know, why has he done this to me? I did what society expected. And she gives up her teaching career, and she contents herself and is content with her children, with, you know, making her children's clothes, with her cooking, with her gardening. You know, that world, she takes pride in it. She takes pride in the fact that she darns his stockings when they've got holes in them, you know, because that's what good housewives do. And you're right, you know, had none of this happened, we probably would never have heard of Elizabeth Packard. I know we've forgotten her name, but she wouldn't have made the mark on the world that she did. But as I say, that through this, you know, actually sending her away, sort of lit the touch paper, as it will. It lit the fire in Elizabeth, and then she just burned so brightly.
And we are, as horrific as what she endured, we are so grateful that she endured it and became that light for all of us, because I couldn't imagine what we as women would be going, what our lives would be like right now had it not been for Elizabeth Packard. And a lot of people were drawing conclusions or drawing parallels between Elizabeth's story and what Britney Spears is going through right now. She just went to court today to try and get the executorship, or whatever they call it, to get that dismissed, you know, trying to, you know, and the same thing, you know, her mental health was weaponized against her. So we do still see it going on today. And, thank God that Elizabeth was as burned as brightly as she did. And Kate, thank you for bringing this story out to us. Marge made an interesting comment, and she said, is it just coincidence that both of these stories happen in Illinois? And I think it's funny in a way that we have an English woman that is teaching us Illinoisans, our own history, because I didn't know the story about the Radium Girls. I certainly did not know Elizabeth Packard's story. And so these are important stories that we need to know about living here in Illinois. So Kate, thank you so much for giving the voice to the Radium Girls, for giving us Elizabeth's story, because it is one that every single person needs to read, because of the legacy that Elizabeth has left behind and what she did for us as women. So thank you so much for this story. And, you made a point about, being a storyteller, and really it's through these stories that we are reminded that that's what connects us all. It's the one thing that we all share together. So thank you so much. And Liza, thank you so much for being here this evening. And I know that we talked a little bit about, a project that you're working on. So hopefully someday in the very near future, we'll have you back. We'll flip the roles. Kate will be the host and Liza will be the guest. I'm so excited about this. I'm actually going to drop that note to our PR department.
Let's do it
when we're over with this. So thank you, ladies, both so much for this wonderful evening. Thank all of you. And those of you now, if you do feel comfortable and you want to turn your cameras on, please feel free before you drop off. But thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for your support, not just of Andersons, but of authors like Kate and like Liza, because without them and their storytelling, Andersons wouldn't be here. And that's the one thing that we love the most is helping bring these stories into your hands. So thank you guys for your support of Andersons. Thank you guys so much for your support of Kate and of Liza. And Liza and Kate, thank you so much for giving us books that we are proud to put in people's hands.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all your support and for inviting me to do this event. And Liza, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your wonderful questions.
Beats working, right? Yeah, thank you.
Exactly. We all get paid for this. That's the best thing. Yeah. All right. Well, everyone, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Kate, for this amazing story. Liza, thank you for being the hostess with the mostest tonight, and for Code Girls for your book. And I can't wait for your next project. So everybody have a wonderful, wonderful evening. The book is available at Anderson's Bookshop on shelf. If you asked for it to be shipped with your ticket, we'll get those out to you. If you wanted to come pick them up in store, there we are. Ooh. Yes, I know. I don't have mine. God, I'm slacker. I don't have my copy with me.
The greatest covers, Kate.
Yes. Source Books has outdone themselves with this book. I mean, they are on fire. It is amazing.
It's a lovely package.
Yes. So thank you all for being here. Again, if you arrange to have your book picked up at the bookstore, you'll get a call when they are ready, or an email. I don't remember how they do that. And I just can't wait for everybody to get their hands and read this book. And when you do, come find me and let's talk about this book. Yeah. Okay.
And find me as well. Let me know what you think.
Yes.
You can visit me at kate-moore.com, or I'm on Twitter at @KateBooks, or I'm on Facebook. So let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you guys.
We should do like a big group read or something. Like let's have a book group or something after the fact. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kate and Liza. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Kate, go to bed.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Liza.
Bye, everybody. Have a good evening.